Okay, today the structure of the Mexican government, as you remember, they've got a constitution that goes back to 1917, and in a lot of ways it looks like the US Constitution. You've got an elected president, you've got an elected legislature, you've got a separate judicial branch, and you also have in Mexico states. So Mexico is a federal republic because it has 31 states that have some powers that are independent of the national government. So in those ways, it looks a lot like the United States. The federal republic, 31 states, each state has its own governor, each state has its own legislature. There's also a national legislature and a president. So on paper, it looks like the US, but in practice, from 1917 up until about 2000, everything was controlled by the PRI. There was only one party that had any power. It was the PRI. And so every state was full of PRI. The national government was controlled by the PRI. And since they were on the same page, basically the national government always told the states what to do. And so you didn't really have a real federal government in practice, even if it was on paper, because the president basically told the states what the law was going to be and what they should be doing. Since the 1990s, you have decentralization. If you remember, the PRI doesn't control everything anymore. There are multiple parties that win elections, that have seats in the legislatures, etc. And so because of that, what you started to see is that states are making some decisions for themselves and making some decisions differently from each other. So for example, Mexico City legalized abortion, and so have some other states in Mexico. On the other hand, some other Mexican states make abortion a crime. So whether or not abortion is legal is a state-by-state thing in Mexico. Gay marriage, also a state-by-state issue in Mexico. Unlike our country, where the Supreme Court has said that both abortion and gay marriage have to be legal nationwide, in Mexico, it's a state-by-state choice. And so that makes them, that's an example of their federalism in practice. Didn't used to be that way, but it is now. Okay, basically they've got an executive branch headed up by a president, much like ours. And their president is elected for a 6-year term with a 1-term limit. And if you remember, that's because in the early days, they wanted to make sure that power was shared and passed around between the elites. So basically 6 years and you're out, 1-term limit, and they call that term sessenio. The election is plurality, so you just have to get the most votes. You don't have to get 50% as long as you get more than everybody else. As far as specific powers in the Constitution, it looks a lot like our president. The president is the head of government. He's also the head of state. He's also the commander-in-chief of the military, so very similar on paper to ours. It used to be, in the PRI days, the president got to nominate every PRI candidate nationwide. And since the PRI won every election, what that meant is basically every government official in Mexico had been chosen by the president and owed his or her job to the president, so they all did whatever the president said. So what you really had under the PRI was not a president with limited powers defined by a constitution, but sort of really a 6-year dictator. And then the president would step down and pass power on to another president who would be the dictator for 6 years, and they would just sort of change hands. That's not true anymore. As we've talked about, the PRI doesn't control everything, and so the president is limited by the Constitution and by his ability to get the Congress and the other states and the other branches to do what he wants, and that's not always easy because there are different parties. So the president is not nearly as powerful as he used to be. As far as the bureaucracy, the executive branch, the agencies and departments that work for the president under the PRI, there were many parastatals, and if you recall from the Nigeria chapter, that's a government-run corporation. So for example, Mex is the government corporation, the parastatal, that owns all the oil and administers and sells all the oil, exports all the oil in Mexico. They run the oil industry there. If you remember, in the 80s and the 90s, Mexico had to take some loans, and some of the strings attached, the condition to the loans included privatization. And so while Pemex still exists, a lot of the old parastatals, government agencies under the PRI, which they could use to sort of give out jobs to people who supported the PRI as a way to maintain power, those are gone now, they've been privatized. So there are a lot fewer of these parastatals in Mexico than there used to be. There's a national legislature, the legislative branch called the Chamber of Deputies. Actually, I apologize. It's the National Congress, and within that you have a Chamber of Deputies and a Senate. So sort of like we have a U.S. Congress with a House of Representatives and a Senate, they have the National Congress, Chamber of Deputies and a Senate, similar powers. They pass laws. The president has to sign them, but they pass laws. The Chamber of Deputies has 500 members. Unlike our House of Representatives, however, 300 of them are elected first past the post. So you divide Mexico up into 300 districts. Each district elects one person to go to the Chamber of Deputies. 200 of them are elected by proportional. So when you vote for the person to represent your district, you also vote for your favorite party. And if, for example, the PRI got 50% of the proportional votes nationwide, they would get 100 of the proportional seats. So they have a mixed system between first past the post or single member district on the one hand and proportional on the other. The Senate, sort of like our Senate, is 3 per state plus 3 for Mexico City. But you'll notice that math doesn't work out, so there are an additional 32 senators who are elected by a national proportional vote. And so similar to the Chamber of Deputies, it's mixed. Each state sends 3, and then nationally, you vote for your favorite party, and then you split up the votes that way. So a mixed system for both. The Chamber of Deputies has a 3-year term with a 4-term limit. So the most time you can spend in the chamber is 12 years, and then you have to step down. The Senate has a 6-year term like ours, but unlike ours, a 2-term limit. So the most time you can spend in the Senate is 12 years. Up until, I think it was 2016, very recently, there was a 1-term limit on both the chamber and the Senate. So you could serve once and then you were gone. And again, that came from the idea of sharing power. But at the same time, eventually Mexico realized they needed some people to stay there for a couple of terms to build up some institutional knowledge, to learn how the institution works. So now it's a 4-term limit for the chamber and a 2-term limit for the Senate. And in both chambers, the party called Morena, which is also the party of the president, López Obrador, has a plurality, but not a majority. So Morena has the most seats but they do not have 50% plus one. So even if they all vote together, they still need to get the support of some other parties to get anything done. Lastly, the courts. Like us, they have a Supreme Court. To get on it, you are nominated by the President, approved by the Senate, so just like ours. Unlike ours, there is a 15-year term. So you serve for 15 years and then you're gone. They have had judicial review since 1994. So if you got a question on an exam about democratization in Mexico and how has it become more democratic recently, you could talk about, well, now it's a multi-party system, it's not just the PRI anymore. You could talk about how before the court basically did whatever the president wanted, but now they have judicial review and they can strike down laws of Congress, so there's more checks and balances. Similarly, when we talk about the legislature, because they used to be all PRI, with the president from the PRI, they were a rubber stamp legislature, meaning they did whatever the president wanted, much like the legislature in China. But now, because there are different parties, Morena, PRI, PAN, PRD, the legislature is actually an independent body that has to, make up its own mind. And so in those ways, Mexico has become more democratic since the fall of the PRI in 2000. The military is sort of unique in Latin America in that they are not political. A lot of the Latin American countries have been dictatorships fairly recently, or if they're not now, the military still plays a big role in politics. Not in Mexico. The military responds to the president's in control. Mostly what they working on, defending the country, obviously, but also what they've been working on the last 8 years is the military has been used to fight the drug cartels. And then underlying all of this is what it looks like on paper. Underlying all of this is, much like Nigeria, a big problem with corruption. You've seen on the video how a couple of times when the immigrants from Guatemala got caught, they were able to just pay people off and keep going. Judges have a reputation of being corrupt. You can pay them off to win the case. So this is like Nigeria, this is an issue that Mexico is dealing with as well, because regardless of what you have on paper, you need people to sort of follow the rules and do things the right way for it to be a democracy.